Welcome, everybody, to this conversation with President Richard Joel, based on President Joel's ELI Talk on knowing and owning our story. My name is Yossi Prager. The other person you can see on the screen is President Richard Joel. I will introduce him and then me, and we will launch right into the conversation. President Joel is a recovering lawyer and teacher of law, a longtime experiential Jewish educator. He spent 15 years leading and transforming the Hillel campus organization. He spent the most recent 11 years as president of Yeshiva University, which happens to be my alma mater. He's a good friend, and maybe most important, he is the father of the woman who taught two of my children to read English. So that's President Joel for you. My name is Yossi Prager. Like the president, I am a recovering lawyer. I worked for a big firm in Manhattan for a few years, and then have spent the last 20 years at the AVI CHAI Foundation. Our focus in North America is on nurturing the energizing nucleus of the next generation of American Jews by building the fields of Jewish day schools and summer camps. And as part of the general marketing of the Jewish message, AVI CHAI developed the ELI Talks that are the basis of this conversation. So with that as background, and Richard, you can interrupt at any point, I'm going to jump in quickly with a summary of what I see as the main point of President Joel's talk, and a thought of my own, and then a first question. So the easiest way to capture the talk, I think, is the importance of knowing our story and owning our story. President Joel says knowing our story means being literate about Jewish ideas. Judaism is much richer than bagels and lox. Owning the story means bringing a sense of spirit and passion and soul. And either literacy or passion is incomplete without the other. That's the essence of the talk. And as I listened to it, I thought it reminded me of an extraordinary passage in the Talmud. There's a verse in Joshua which says, and he, talking about the student of Torah, he will engage in his Torah day and night. Now, the literal meaning of that verse, the his Torah is a capital H. We're talking about God's Torah that person engages in. The Talmud takes the extraordinary step and lowercases that H, and understands that a Jew who studies Torah has made it his own, and on that basis rules that a scholar can waive the honor due to him as a Torah scholar. Because while the Torah started out as God's Torah, and maybe that honor could not have been waived, but it became the Torah scholar's honor once he owns it. And you know, that's our story as Jewish people, taking the Torah and owning it. So I'm going to launch right in. You quote a Mishnah which ends, "Now go and study." In your notion of Jewish literacy, what's the balance between stories and law?
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for the question. I think the balance between stories and law is much more an integration of stories and law. I mean, I think one of the big issues that we have in Jewish life, bichlal, in general, is that it's not a separable part of identity. I'm right-handed, I'm left-handed, I like tacos, and oh, by the way, I'm Jewish. Whatever your flavor of Jewishness, the essence of that Jewishness is that it is who you are. It is the sea you swim in. When I used to work for Hillel, I coined the phrase that the purpose of Hillel was to maximize the number of Jews doing Jewish with other Jews. And some people said, no, you're not literate, it should be doing Jewish things. Other people said it was a code word for orthodoxy because it's doing Jewish instead of being Jewish. I plead not guilty to both of those statements, but I do think the issue and the essence and the story of Jewish people collectively and individually is that you're walking the walk of Jewishness is critical, but it only happens as you talk the talk. It's not I'm going to have a period of learning and I'm going to have a period of playgroup. I was thinking when we had talked about prefatory to this conversation, your question of how much how much is specific learning and how much is specific doing. So I thought about the curriculum in most preschools and even early childhood education. And I said, maybe we have something to learn from that, because I think what we do is we teach everything by doing in a certain way. I guess you also we were talking just before the thousands of people joined us for this conversation, and we were talking about the fact, you reminded me that today is the fast day of the 17th of Tammuz, which begins the 3-week mourning period that culminates in the fast of the 9th of Av, which commemorates the destruction of Jerusalem multiple times and the exile of our people. And it did occur to me that the conversation we're having is so important, because we see that again and again in our history, when we forget who we are, when we forget how we are, when we forget the way we're supposed to behave, when we forget not just the folkways of what we do, but what underlies it, then there's destruction. And again, the lesson is, don't you get it? You've been given this great, precious gift. Live by it, and you get to matter in the world. You really should interrupt me, because I can really go on.
Well, so I want to go back to this question of stories and law, and I think that you are correct, of course, in saying that there needs to be an integration of the two. It's not just a question of balance. I want to ask you to respond to a blistering critique of Judaism by Thomas Jefferson. From the 1700s. Ethics were so little studied among the Jews that in their whole compilation called the Talmud, there is only one treatise on moral subjects. What a wretched depravity of sentiment and manners must have prevailed before such corrupt maxims could have obtained credit. It is impossible to collect from these writings a consistent series of moral doctrine.
Yeah. Well, Jefferson should have stuck to writing the Declaration of Independence, and tried to also look a little bit as to whether his own moral character was integrated properly into his life. I mean, the problem with Jefferson's reading is that he didn't understand that the Avot was the only tractate that specifically dealt with the rarefied issue of how we treat each other. In fact, the entire corpus of the Talmud is about how we integrate into our living, into our decision-making, into our relations with the human and with the transcendent, the kind of moral compass that teaches us how to go. The point is that we are a people of deed, and embedded in that deed is a way to live, not something that we can in a rarefied way say, these are my ethics. And I think that's a major issue. I also have to do just a minute of full disclosure, Yossi, and you talked about law and storytelling. So full disclosure is I'm an Orthodox Jew. I don't much like the adjective. Rabbi Shai Yosef Cohen, who was the chief rabbi of Haifa, told me that until the first time he came to America, he didn't know he was Orthodox. But that means primarily that I view Jewish life as a legal system. I'm an attorney, I'm trained in an American legal system, but I'm equally trained in a Jewish legal system. So when you talk about the notion of law, so law suffuses all that I do as a Jew. However, for 90% of the Jews, and I don't mean it in a condescending way, maybe in a silly way, it's not the 10 Commandments, but it's the 10 suggestions. So I can relate to you in terms of how primary the rule of law has to be, but we also have to discuss the ongoing process of maintaining a Jewish people by saying that we can't always fall back on law, because there has to now be a mutual acceptance of the terms of law. In the Orthodox community, there is the sense of obligation, there's the sense of non-negotiability, there's a sense of legal parameters to what we do and how we behave. That doesn't exist in the rest of the Jewish community, and there are too few of us in the Orthodox community to only be talking to each other.
So I think that makes perfect sense. I would argue that even for people who don't see the law as authoritative and binding, people who think of things as the 10 suggestions, even they should be drawn to Jewish law as the source of Jewish values and Jewish wisdom.
Absolutely. Absolutely, but I'm not sure they're going to get there just by saying this is the law, or by saying just read. That's why the knowing the story and the owning the story comes into it. I think you have to I think you have to experience it. I think there are those who are of intellect armed, or of intellectualism armed, who will say, I'm going to read this corpus of literature and I'll be very taken with it because, of course, it is extraordinary. I still think there's a step to go after that before you become a Jew who's able to transmit her or his Jewishness to the next generation, which ultimately, by the way, is the bottom line question. How do we make this vital and vibrant enough so that it transmits from us to our children or our grandchildren?
And how is it meaningful enough for us to want to transmit it to our children?
Oh, that's right. That's right. Especially in a world or in our community where there are not a lot of boundaries, where everything seems within reach, where there are a tremendous amount of tastes and things to do that can perhaps be what I would call a siren song of attractiveness. On the other hand, when you get involved in the community and the corpus of Jewishness, you come to see how it becomes not a refuge, but a launching pad for maximizing our time on this planet and for doing it with joy and with meaning and with purpose and with quality.
So I want to probe one point in something you said. You said that for people who are not highly intellectual, they're not going to study the whole body, the corpus of the Torah and the Talmud. So what for them is the Jewish literacy? What's the recipe for them, or what's the curriculum?
I think there's a difference between high intellectualism and being illiterate. I think there's a continuum there. I mean, clearly the Hasidic movement responded to the notion that there wasn't enough passion in Jewishness by providing those ecstatic situations there. I think that they're just like for civilization to go on, there have to be core competencies of knowledge, of core knowledge, and of the capacity to learn. The capacity to learn, I think every Jew, if not armed with a core capacity of our story, right? The Bible, and I don't mean Bible stories. I mean the lessons of Torah, the extrapolations that we can make from the narratives that we have, and I'll also say an understanding of a legal system that has gone from the written Torah into the great understanding. So I would say that a core knowledge of the Jewish story, which is Tanakh, a core knowledge of customs and ceremonies from whatever tradition, and a core knowledge of the Jewish life cycle and the year cycle. If you have that, and if you are in a community, and if you're in a community that observes together, I think you have the real capacity to see the joy in it. I was once at a GA, at a General Assembly of the Council of Federations, and my unenviable task was to interview Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who was, of course, a great scholar and a great character as well. And the challenge of this was he was touted as a great personage of Jewish life, which he was, and there were about 700 participants in this lecture. And any of us who know Rabbi Steinsaltz know that if you are the person asking questions, generally you only get to ask one question, because then he goes on after that. And I remember at a certain point I said to him, Rabbi Steinsaltz, what do you say to all of us gathered who are concerned about the perpetuation of Jewish life in the face of assimilation? And he looked and smiled and said, don't worry at all. The Nikud Yehudi, the essence of the Jew, das Pintele Yid, is in all of us and eventually comes out and will triumph. And he started to go on, and I cut him off at risk of my life. And I said, that's very nice if you believe in this world and the next world and know that eventually the Jew comes home. But simple data says that a huge number of Jews are not rejecting Jewishness, they're just not even approaching it. You have to have a better answer than that. So he looked at me and stopped for a minute, and then he got a twinkle in his eye, and he used a fragment from, I think it's Tehillim, from Psalms, and he said, well, here's my answer. Ta'amu u'ru'u ki tov. Right? Let them taste it, and they'll see that it's good. Now, the actual sentence is, Ta'amu u'ru'u ki tov Hashem. Let them taste it, and they'll see that God is good. But I think his was kind of a classic Lubavitch answer, but I think it should be an answer for all of us, that in today's world, where we haven't inherited both the depth of the story, and we haven't been compelled to be Jewish, and I also said in my ELI talk that this is the first generation where being Jewish is an option and not a condition, that the only way to exercise the option is what Rabbi Steinsaltz said. Taste it and see that it's good, and you taste it through knowledge and you taste it through experience.
So I want to try to put a stake in the ground and see if you agree or disagree.
As long as I'm not lying in the ground, that's fine.
I believe that a critical piece of Jewish education, without which you can't get to what you call knowing and owning your story, is for students to graduate with the ability to learn, study these texts on their own over the course of a lifetime in their original. Meaning if your only access to our texts is in translation, then you are sort of more impoverished than you have a right to be Jewishly. And to get everything out of owning your Judaism, you have to be able to access those texts in the original. And so that for me, in thinking about, you know, Jewish education, that for me is a bottom line. How do you think, what do you think about that?
I think in an aspirational sense, you're right. And anything approximating the real world, we might as well give up and run the other way. I have the privilege of being the steward of Yeshiva University. I don't even want to hazard a guess as to whether I would be on safe ground in saying that every one of my undergraduates who graduates with years of study and years of learning, and most of them with years of day school, are as comfortable as you and I would want them to be in studying all of our texts in the original Hebrew, notwithstanding in the original Aramaic.
Right.
And I also know that you can have a community of people who are incredibly literate in Hebrew, but won't see it as Lashon Kodesh, as the sacred language. So I think you're right, Yossi, but I think while you're busy making sure everybody's speaking in Hebrew, they're going to be busy, you know, taking tennis lessons. So I don't think it's, I don't think, let me put it to you in the inverse. I wouldn't agree with you that the only way for someone to be a knowing, practicing, and grateful Jew is if they are fluent in Hebrew.
Right. So I agree with what you just said too. I think fluency in modern Hebrew is different from the ability to read the Chumash in Hebrew. Make your way through one way or another, make your way through that text. I think doing things in translation, I mean, I'm almost relating to the emotional experience of ownership, right? If it's a foreign document, then you don't own it. And so it's hard. I mean, I know there's so many adult education programs that start with the premise it's impossible to teach people Hebrew in a limited amount of time that adults have available, and so everything is done in translation. And some of those have been wildly successful. I think about the Wexner Heritage Program. But if we are building an education system from the bottom up, I think that feeling of ownership that you described has to come from feeling that it's not a foreign language, not for speaking.
I agree 100% with you. I just know that we have a challenge getting 90% of our children to be in any kind of serious, not even day school, but some kind of serious encounter with Jewish knowledge and Jewish education. So if we're going to say that the first thing that has to come, Reishis Chachma Lashon Kodesh, that the beginning of wisdom is in knowing Hebrew, I think it ends the conversation fairly quickly. I know it's frustrating, but I don't know that that's. I'm not sure that I'm prepared to agree with you wholeheartedly.
Okay, and maybe there's a difference between the 90% who aren't getting an immersive Jewish education and the others.
I think that's right, but I'm not sure that the difference is Hebrew.
Yeah.
I'm sure that I'm not the majority opinion in this, and by saying what I'm saying, I'm not discounting the role of Ivrit. I don't know. I agree with you. I don't know what it's like. I don't know what it's like to learn Torah in English. Right? I don't know what it's like, and I even in praying. So when I pray, even when I'm not saying the words on the page, it's in a Hebrew context because it takes me to my very unique and distinct place. I understand that. I just, when we're looking, as you say, from the ground up to say what we have to do, I think we have to get people's attention before we teach them, diktuk.
Okay, so how do we get people's attention? For the 90% who are not in immersive Jewish education, you want to inspire passion, soulfulness. What's the recipe for that?
Oh boy, if I could do that, you think I'd be talking to you for free on the internet? By the way, and I think it's a challenge for the 10% who do have an education. I don't think this is a no-brainer, and it's not the Orthodox looking to the poor unwashed masses. I think this is a challenge we all have. I believe that our Yahadut, our Jewishness, is not an alone practice. I believe that the first prescription is community. I believe that the first words that God spoke of virtually to a human being was lo tov hayot adam levado, that it's not good for the human to be alone. I think we need the wholeness of community, whether it's the intimate community of two loving partners, or whether it's the nuclear family, or whether it's the community, or whether it's having enough intelligence and graciousness of heart to realize that we are all brothers and sisters traveling the planet. So the first thing is that you need to have the boundaries of community. That I so marvel at anybody who alone in Alaska discovered their Jewishness. It's a work of great gladness, but I don't know how to do it. I don't know how to do a Hebrew dance by myself, and I don't know how to sing Zmirot alone. It's profoundly depressing. So the first prescription is we need community. And I think we also need a community of communities, because every community is going to be different than the other. Once there's community, once there's a bunch of us, right, then there's a bunch of us celebrating Shabbos. I think you really have to go to the landmarks, to the totems and taboos of our people to start with, and at the same time identify it with our story, which begins with Adam and continues to tomorrow.
It's a beautiful thought. I have some questions here from the audience. I'm going to give you first a real softball.
There's an audience?
Is there more? I'm sorry?
I said there's an audience?
Is there more to our story than Tanakh? How is modern history also our story?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think of course modern history is our story. I think, though, from my perspective, that we do distinguish between our primary text, our sacred literature, that we think has some binding influence on our law and lore, and our commentaries, and the history that we write, and the story that we write with and for our children. Often Esther and I, when the kids particularly were younger, and we'd be doing something that we thought was memorable for the kids, and my wife would turn to me and say, "You understand what we're doing? We're building Jewish memories." And I think, we often talk about the fact that we are a people of memory and we are a people of destiny. And I think that continuum is critical. I don't think that we say that everything that comes out of our mouth is holy. I hope we work to make everything that comes out of our mouth clean. I think there is a difference between our sacred literature and the compendium of works that are written till this day that try to emulate how we relate to God and how we behave ourselves, and the story of our people, which is also an enriching manifestation of who we are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I would add to that we are so blessed to be in a generation post the State of Israel. And so the question of our modern history relates immediately back to the last time the Jews had sovereignty, which was at the end of the period of the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees. We had a temple that continued for a while more, but this ability to pick up into Jewish sovereignty, so it raises a whole set of questions for us that the State of Israel as a country and that we as Jews continue to think about and struggle with. And there's certainly in Europe today so many accusations and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's a very complicated world, but the reality is this is the first time since before the Common Era that we as Jews control our own destiny in our own country. So for me, that changes everything about how we think about our story. And
it changes a lot, but it's a little bit of hubris to think that we do control our destiny and we do control our lives. We're living in a world that's very complicated with a different set of challenges that beset our state of Israel, but also beset Jews in other places. Jews in the diaspora during the time of exile also, certainly I don't want to sound like a relativist. There is a big Sof Pasuk and a big new chapter, a whole different reality with the reality of the state of Israel. But it's also coming at a time when there are all kinds of other challenges to our peoplehood that don't necessarily come from anti-Semitism. Sometimes you long for the good old anti-Semitism because it used to keep Jews together. And in fact, you know, a lot of our sacred literature that I speak about happened after the destruction and was a result of the Mishnayot and the Tanaitic and the Amarah periods when Jews were all over the world, including in Palestine. I do know that when you think about the state of Israel, it changes the equation. It gives us a grounding, a physical grounding, as well as an ethical grounding. In the light of rampant assimilation that goes throughout the world, including the state of Israel, there is still a notion of a Jewish peoplehood that exists, and God forbid we didn't have Israel. But there are lots of complications that come in the way too. When I was reading the graduation speeches of my ultimate predecessor, Dr. Bernard Revel, to Yeshiva College from 1932 to 1940, it was fascinating because he spent a lot of time talking about the destiny of the Jewish people of living with the kind of values that would influence both American civilization and Western civilization. And he was talking about the gathering clouds of darkness that were coming out of Europe. And there was no mention of Israel. And then you look post-48, and so much of what occupied the Jewish mind was Israel. And sometimes, which is our want, when we have something we're concentrating on, we're forgetting the larger picture as well. So in some ways, Israel became to the large Jewish community, not in Israel, the replacement for Jewish knowledge and for Jewish meaning. It was enough to say Jewish identity is we have a state of Israel. Well, thank God, it's 65 years later, and we know that those same issues continue to be with us. So Israel's the game changer, it's not the game ender.
Right, absolutely. You know, you raise this question about, you tell a story in your talk about the time you were in Russia and you met a beggar who was insistently seeking some rubles until he heard you speak some Yiddish and figured out that you were a Jew and then played music for you and attempted to give the rubles back.
That's correct.
So we know that the impact of the shared past is there, and I think many of us have had experiences in, you know, with Jews in other countries like that. Now that Judaism, as you say, is an option and not a condition, at least in America, how do you expect this to affect the formation of a shared future?
Yeah, look, that's the critical issue, right? If quote, Yiddish, and by that I just don't mean the language, I mean the shared culture, right, sustained us for generations, what's the next Yiddish? I've been thinking about that, and there's no easy answer to it because we're living in a much larger world where we're not kept in. And what is it? And I only come up with two answers, and I don't know if it's enough. One is community, and one is Israel, notwithstanding what I just said. That the lingua franca of the Jews, right, has to be that we identify ourselves as family. And we have to identify the family homestead as Israel. Then how do you go about retrieving and building the family folkways, being able to joke together about old Aunt Gertie, or celebrate the birth of our children? So many of us go on this genealogical website called Genie. I just attended a wedding of a second cousin that I didn't know I had. Most of my family was from South Africa, and I have no ties to them. And she reached out to me on Genie and said that her son was getting married in America, and would we come? And I met her for the first time, and I can't tell you how I felt. These are a complete group of strangers. She's my second cousin. I don't have second cousins. And then I realized that my second cousin meant that my father and her father were first cousins, and my grandfather and her grandfather were brothers. And her great-grandfather and my great-grandfather were the same person. That gave me a feeling that fuels me forward. And the question is, how do we build that in a much more complicated world? What's the genie that's not the virtual genie on internet where we see, you know, all the lines and see the 6 degrees of separation? How do we build that? And I think that's very important.
Right. So I guess I have two, they're not answers to that, but two sort of responses. One is, I think in American culture, it's almost offensive to think about being preferential to your people, right? I think people find the idea of in marriage, I mean, the studies say half of American Jews think standing for in marriage only is racist. And why should I be more attached to, you know, the Jew next town over than my next door neighbor? And so Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik and Professor Zev Magin have both made an argument, I think really compelling, about how universal love doesn't make any sense unless it starts from the notion of preferential love. If you can't love one person, you can't love everybody. And if you love one person, then you can love your children and your cousins, exactly as you were describing. And it's the love for extended family that ultimately helps us be empathetic enough to expand that feeling to people who are not part of our family. And so depriving ourselves of the attachment to the Jewish people on the grounds that we should love everybody is ultimately self-defeating.
Right. Of course, I think you are completely right. And it's always frustrating to me when people say, you know, why are you preferential to Jews? Isn't that being racist? It's being racist if the only reason you're being preferential to Jews is that you have a genetic commonality. Of course, you love in concentric circles of intimacy. And hopefully all of us believe that humankind is one of those circles, but it's an outside circle. By my giving special love to my wife doesn't mean that there aren't other friends who I esteem. It does mean that there's something unique that I share with my wife, and then with my children, and then with my extended family, and then with my community. A shared bond, shared folkways, shared stories, shared destinies, shared dreams. Frankly, I don't think people walk away from endogamy because they think it's racist. I think they walk away from endogamy if the only reason you want someone to marry a Jew is because they're a Jew. And I think people walk away not because they've encountered Jewishness and find it wanting. I think it's completely non-present in their lives. And that's part of the fact that they're undereducated, under-celebrated, right? Under community attached. That's a great word. Hope there's no transcript of this. And so I really very strongly think we have to be strong enough to say, don't give in to the contemporary notion that we all love everyone. It's like you say, you can't love everyone without ending up loving no one. And in fact, when we love those close to us most deeply, it provides, it's like a cup that keeps spilling over. It provides more. It's like light. It provides the capacity to love beyond that group. But what a terrible thing when we define ourselves in saying that our own particularism or a group of particularists is a bad thing because it will keep us away from others. No, it will enable us to reach beyond ourselves. It gives us that security, and it gives us something to say to others.
Right, and I guess the challenge that we have is making that case that you just made, that Rabbi Soloveitchik and Dr. Magin made, in a way that does not sound abstract and highfalutin, but that really makes people feel in terms of their genuine emotions of love and attachment and connection.
Well, I think, look, first of all, there's always the truth that those of us who are in any way definingly Jewish really do have an obligation to conduct ourselves in the public sphere as models of caring and of decency and of goodness, not necessarily of saying whatever you say I'm going to agree with. I don't think that's the way the world works. I also think that you know, years ago at Yeshiva University there was a program conceived by the late Rabbi Morris Besdin of blessed memory, which was called the Jewish Studies program. It was for kids with limited backgrounds, and he had a theme that he used. They used to put it on T-shirts, and he said what they were doing at JTS at Yeshiva University was it, not about it. And of course, his point was taste it and see how good it is. The point was, it's not just how do we establish ways to describe, transmit, or train people to have the information about Jewishness, any more than an online learning that simply gives information is not education, because there has to be the experience of it. And I think many of us are struggling within the notion of online education to talk about teaching and learning and to see how we use technology to effectively do that. But I do think that the key to this is how do we, on different levels in different places, do it, not about it. And how do other institutions, whether it's educational institutions or communal institutions or synagogues or issue institutions, do it, not about it.
Right. So I think you definitely hit on something by saying doing it in community is the answer to how to get people. I mean, it's this circular problem, right? You don't really know what Judaism is until you've done it, and you're not going to do it until you know what it is, and therefore you have to draw people in for that first experience in community.
When you have a situation which we have now, where a majority of Jews don't grow up in a family that in second nature resonates with Jewishness, with Jewish doings, with Jewish learning, where you don't see mom sitting and studying Chumash or dad doing the same thing, where you're not in the community where Shabbat is there, where you don't grow up naturally saying that there's a culture of responsibility, not necessarily just rights. For that first group, so they start off doing it naturally because it's mother's milk. We still have an obligation to have them be able to own their own story, to be able to feel the passion. But I think beyond that, the notion, I think, and everybody's longing for community, for a place that can be mine, the place where I can launch myself. And I think that's why we have a responsibility to provide it's, not about it. That's why a preschool is so important, because they get it. That's why, you know, I was always taken with the Christian notion of a megachurch, where it's a little bit one-stop shopping. You know, for the Orthodox community, you don't need one-stop shopping, because we start off knowing we need our synagogue, and we need our day school, and we need our mikveh, and we need our kosher butcher. And so you're attuned to the fact that there are multiple institutions. Right? To the rest of the Jews, maybe we really have to think about one-stop shopping, that all things emanate from one place.
So I want to be careful for us in not making this about the Orthodox and the other than Orthodox, because there are 40,000 kids in non-Orthodox day schools in any given year, and there are 70,000 non-Orthodox kids in summer camps, and the creation of the new minyanim that are taking place all over the country, and new Torah study programs. And there's just been, at the same time as we have seen a kind of assimilation or slipping away of some people who no longer have had the experience to think about rejecting it, there has been, a terrific explosion of activity in a much smaller segment of sort of outside of Orthodoxy in the conservative reform post-denominational world. And that's something for sure that needs to be nourished.
Look, absolutely. I did spend 15 years, wonderful years of my life, learning from so many great people at Hillel. And when I speak about the Orthodox, there's not a hint of triumphalism. It's just that they start from a different set of givens, and it's the givens of what you talked about, law. It's the givens of obligation. A little bit you can start as an Orthodox Jew saying, I'm stuck with it. Hopefully we disabuse people of that. So the only differentiation I'm making is on that level. I do think that victory is not to make everybody Orthodox. Victory is to have people know their story, own their story, be strong celebratory Jews. If I want to be a triumphalistic Orthodox Jew, I say the only way that everybody's going to see how right I am is if they own and love their Jewishness and will engage in arguments for the sake of heaven. And hopefully I'll win. But if I don't win, right, that's between the people and God, then we keep the Jewish story going, because the world so needs this story. It needs these set of values. It needs these non-negotiables. It needs this notion of the human being being an elevated creature created in the image of God with a mandate to matter in the world. These things really matter. How we do that. By the way, I really believe very deeply in day schools, and I hope, and I'll do anything to help, get as many students in non-Orthodox day schools as possible, because they'll learn the story. You and I both know that the numbers that are in the non-Orthodox day schools are wonderful, but once you get to 8th grade, you know, how much do they slip off then? And it raises all kinds of questions from a communal perspective of what we need to do to kind of do spiritual triage for the bulk of the Jews who are not active parts of a conservative community and not active parts of a Reform community. Those are wins. Those are wins, and the respective communities and all of us together can find ways to deepen and make more profound that. It's not even about those who have enough Jewish pride generated from a connection to Israel. That too is a win. But we both know the figures, and we both know that there's a terrible concern about the next generation and the one after that.
Right, so I think we're really talking about two things worth separating. And I'll tell you, the reason that your talk was so meaningful to me, inspiring, was because you insisted on people owning, mastering, knowing enough about it for it to really be meaningful.
Right.
And that may not be possible with, you know, 75% of American Jewry. And so, you know, the question is how you balance, on the one hand, real aspirations for the 25% of American Jews who could own their Judaism and make contributions to the Jewish people as owners, and, you know, and how you reach out to the other 75% where that may not be a realistic expectation. And I think we have to be able to balance both of those, because if we begin to define down what we're looking for from the 25%, then I think, you know, everything you talked about in your talk is at risk.
I think you're exactly right. And that's why I don't think that knowing your story necessarily comes before owning your story. I think they work in integration. I think that that Rabbi Steinsaltz is right, that you have to have lots of different Jewish tastes so that people get interested. I think part of the concern is if we're not living close together, how do we end up using social media in such a way not to be the end, but sometimes to be the beginning or the connector? But I don't think ultimately you love someone or you hug someone over Facebook. But I think you're right in that. I recall, and I have many such cases, but when I had the privilege of helping to start the Birthright program, and I remember taking groups of students to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. And I remember that beforehand I would orient them, and I would tell some of them that when they walk up to the Western Wall, they're simply going to see a wall. And it's okay, because there'll be other things they'll see with which they will resonate. Right? The first time I went to the Kotel, I saw a wall. Subsequently, I was going through old pictures, and I came upon a photo of my father who had died when I was 13. And it was a photo from 1935, and he was standing at the Kotel. And I've never related to the Kotel since then as anything other than my sacred possession. And I remember some students going to the Kotel, right, and all of a sudden they felt a part, I'll say, of the story. They connected with it. Now, if that's the end of it, shame on us. And I don't think you take them right from there to a yeshiva in the old city and say, start learning. But I think as you get, some people can be attracted through the intellect, some through the emotion. If you're satisfied with either of those being the end, then it's a truncated Jewishness. Right? If there's not a need for the flavors of Jewish food, if there's not a need for the, I would say, for the disciplines of knowing that we have responsibilities, and that comes with some absolutes. And I think all the movements have some absolutes in them. They might be different absolutes. I think it's essential. I think, you know, you can get overwhelmed, but I come from a Hillel background. So you built a place, right, that wasn't a retreat center, but was a launching pad. And you had lots of different modalities. And for us, success wasn't, here's the model of Jew that we want to present. For us, the model was, if a Jewish young person leaves campus and they say, you know, this Jew stuff really matters to me, then we win. And then you have to hope that in the community that they go out to, there are enterprises and institutions and people who say, welcome sister, welcome brother, let's build together.
Great. Okay, here's another one from the audience. We at least know there are 3 people listening.
Sorry.
Do you think the role of the synagogue must change? If so, how? If not, how would you staunch the flow of Jews out of the pews?
Well, it also depends on the definition of synagogue. There's no question that if we had a people who would be praying 3 times a day and only praying 3 times a day, it would be a colossal waste. Right? So to believe that the goal of being Jewish is to be able to sit in the synagogue and say your prayers, it's not enough, and it doesn't work. And I do believe that prayer, and I do believe that connecting with the Almighty is a real important part of the day. And by the way, doing it communally, not just privately, is a critical part of what we've been talking about community. However, I think we have, and I'm really not trying to criticize anyone. I'm being descriptive. I think we've gone too far in making the synagogue into the Jewish church, and I think at this time where there aren't the normal boundaries of community, and I don't know what I'm talking about here, I promise. So let's just take it as my ignorant thing. I think the synagogue can and should be more a launching pad for Jewish life, responsibility, and celebration. And I think with resources being husbanded, I think if we look more to a community enterprise that includes a synagogue, but also is a place for learning and study, is also a place for education, is also, I'm sounding a little bit like Mordechai Kaplan, but with God included in the mix. The notion of a civilization provoker, of a sacred civilization provoker that could be synagogues, I think has to be more and more real. And I think there are many synagogues that do that. But we have to get into that business. What's the usefulness of mass technology? I think we have to figure out how to master it. But I don't think we're going to be a great people because we're going to be online together while we're watching Survivor.
Okay. I'm seeing if we have another question. I think what we should do is begin to wind down. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I have some thoughts, and then I'm going to give you the final opportunity to stir everybody up in the way that only you can. Not in the strawberry, Darryl Strawberry way, only in the positive way. So to what degree does buy-in in the story depend on belief in God? Right? In your talk, you mentioned, as you said it here again, we're a people of deed and not creed. But what binds us to the rituals and the ethical laws if not a belief in God? And I think there actually is an answer to that question in Israel. What's so interesting, and I see it through AVI CHAI's work in Israel, is large, thousands and maybe tens of thousands of young adults and parents who are not themselves, they don't feel bound by Jewish law, and their beliefs in God vary, who nonetheless are deeply engaged in Torah study. And you really saw it come to a point when Ruth Calderon made her inaugural address at the Knesset, and essentially it became a Talmud class. And the applause came not only from the Chiloni people in the crowd, but also from the Dati and even the Haredi people. And it was just a beautiful moment where community was built around Torah. But that community was not necessarily, they didn't necessarily share the same creed. So how do you think about that in terms of owning and knowing your story?
It's such a great and complicated question. In my family, we always joked about the fact that that should we die and be taken to the pearly gates, and when we get there, there's somebody nailed to a cross, and St. Peter starts a discussion with us. So I always say, it doesn't matter to me, except in one way. I really would like to taste lobster, and I don't get to. And don't take my words. I know whenever we speak in this medium, it's always a danger. Don't take it too seriously. What I meant was, even without the Godhead, right? Torah has given me a life of joy and love and beauty and hopefully mattering, of an appreciation of the world and celebrating life in multiple time frames at the same time. It built everything in. It would have been enough. But would I do it if I didn't believe that it was a way that was divinely mandated? I don't think so. To me, it begins with a relationship between the human and God. To me, the notion of what the human is predicated on being created in the image of God. To me, it's not happenstance that the first of the 10 suggestions or commandments is Anochi Hashem Elohim, that I am the Lord your God. I think in a deeply philosophic way, it starts with the notion that all is not hopeless. And all is not hopeless because there's a master of the universe who has plans beyond our time scheme and beyond our place, but has plans, and that we get to matter together with that God. So as far as I'm concerned, and we are a people of deed, not creed, but we choose these deeds because of our creed. In other words, it's not about catechism, it's about doing, it's about mitzvah, right? But it's predicated on the fact that there's a God. Now, if you say to me, if there are people who have trouble with God, well, I'd like to meet the person who hasn't at one point or another had trouble with God. I think it's a non-negotiable, and I think we struggle until we try to either understand God's ways or say, one day maybe I'll understand, or I don't have to. I mean, I'm always taken with the fact that our brain is this large. And the scientists tell us that at maximum capacity, we have use of less than, I think, 20% of our minds. So to say that this much gray matter has to be able to understand everything and every conundrum of life is just an incredible hubris and an incredible arrogance. So I believe, and when I pray, I'm praying to my God. And I believe that God hears. And I don't know what that means, right? But I struggle to understand that more. The harder challenge is everyone's not the same. And everyone doesn't choose to believe. And some don't want to take it on. And some find it not meaningful. I feel bad for them because I don't know how they're not bereft. My friend Avram Infeld always says that even an atheist has to believe in God because it's important that they know that the job is taken. Right? But having said that, I then say, okay, go back again to Rabbi Steinsaltz, Tamu Ukitov, in this world where we are all flailing around for a way to get through the day and to matter and to have nobility in our own practice, in our own peoplehood, in our own stories, in our own totems and taboos, are these wonderful things that give us a meaningful life. So do I think you start by wrestling God to the ground? No, we're part of the family. And let's celebrate the family. And as far as Israel's concerned, it is a wonderful breakthrough. That I remember when we were building Hillels in Israel, and we started a Seudat Shlishit program where we would invite rock stars to gather in a coffee house at Shalosh Yudas time to tell their Jewish journey. And people would come just to meet the rock star. And we would incorporate into it some Zemirot. And then right after Shabbat, we'd make Havdalah and there'd be a concert. And I thought it was great. And that's what we're doing now in much more serious ways in Israel with Ruth Calderon and many others who are doing that. And I think it's great because it does mean that people are starting to know their story. I have to ask you a hard question, which is, do you really think that if there's no spiritual element to this, and if there's no sense of a Jewish destiny based on God, we're not going to have challenges in the second generation and in the third generation and in the fourth generation? And only because they happen to be within the boundaries from Kfar Ludim to Lud, that somehow it will all be all right? I don't think so. I think we have to wrestle with it. But I'd say don't let the issue of belief get in the way of a passionate Jewishness.
So two things kind of in response to that, I think very eloquent answer to a question. One, you talk about everybody struggles with God. One of the things that really helped me when I was a student at Yeshiva College many years ago was Dr. Lamb, who, I forget already which book he wrote this in, but he also said it, that Judaism wants us not to believe in God, but to have a relationship with God. So Eli Wiesel said the same thing. And so we don't have to pass some kind of hurdle about what do we believe. We have to be in relationship with. And I think all of us, I remember when I had a medical crisis some years ago, there was no question that I felt that both before and thankfully after when it was all resolved. And you can carry that with you. I think about my wedding. I think about the birth of my first daughter. So, you know, belief is almost the wrong question, even though I framed it that way. The other thing I hear you say is that you can, although you in some way feel sad for people who don't feel themselves in that kind of relationship with the divine, you also can see a community built on Torah with different understandings of where that Torah came from and binding, not binding, that we can build a healthy Torah-based community without sharing common assumptions about creed. And I think that's really important in Israel, and I think it has real implications for America too.
Yossi, I think that's right, but I don't think the price, I think absolutely it's right. I don't think the price of right, though, is to become a relativist, to say there's this truth, there's that truth, there's that truth. I think the real kind of pluralism is for us to love each other, to say, I think everything you said is right, but I think those people are really wrong, because I think I'm right. Okay, that doesn't negate the joy, it doesn't negate our relationship, it doesn't negate the value of what they're doing. I just always worry, as an Orthodox Jew, the feeling that the price of my entry is that I have to negate my beliefs.
Right. So as an Orthodox Jew in the Jewish community, I recognize that same tension. On the other hand, I think if you come with that as your first comment, then people feel alienated and unwelcome.
Completely right.
So, you know, the first you need the sense of community, and then you can come to those disagreements.
That's right. I was just meeting with one of my students who had who received a prestigious scholarship and is working with a broader base of Jews in an educational system. And that person, frankly, was made to feel very self-conscious, because kind of the buy-in was, we all have our different ways. Let's be reasonable and bridge all our ways. And the person felt targeted because somehow their sense of commitment was made to seem as if it was narrow, particularistic, and alienating. So I think we all have to be sensitive to that and allow all of us our particular space and not judge each other, even as we are allowed to have our rock-ribbed convictions.
Right. So I want to close with a story from a midrash, and then I will turn it over to you for a final word. This is a midrash that has become actually a song by Yehuda, but I have no idea what the source of this midrash is. It now seems to be commonly known. It's about the creation of the birds. Mm-hmm. On the fifth day, the Bible says God created the birds. And apparently when the birds were created, they noticed they had these heavy appendages on their backs. And they didn't really know what to do with them, but on the sixth day, when the animals were created, the animals began chasing after the birds, and the animals were so much faster because they weren't weighed down by these appendages. And at some point, the birds began to complain to God and said, how could you do this to us? At which point, God showed them how to use the wings to fly. And that changed everything. What they thought had been encumbrances was actually the thing that enabled them to soar. And when I think about your knowing and owning Judaism, owning and knowing Torah, I think of that for my own life, sort of the transition from, you know, school in which all of the study is at some level an encumbrance like the birds have, and then growing into adulthood and seeing how it really enables me to soar and just absolutely love my life as a Jew. So with that, I turn it over to you.
I think it's very beautiful, Yossi. You did steal my closing story because I didn't know it was a midrash. And I tell a story where the punchline is that God says to his creature, foolish bird, you have wings, you can fly. So we'll have to find the midrash together. But instead, look, first of all, I thank you for this vehicle and for this opportunity. The more we talk to each other, and the more we engage conversation, and more we're honest, but also excited about our Jewish future. It's very important. You have, thank God, wonderful children. We have 6 wonderful children and 4.5 grandchildren. It's all about that. So I guess I'll close with one of my favorite stories, which I heard from Rabbi David Wolpe, who's a great teacher of Torah. He talks about the little child who's sitting in his dining room with butcher block paper and crayons and markers and pencils and pens, and he's busily scribbling away. His parent comes into the room and turns to the child and says, "My child, what are you doing?" The kid looks up and says, "Me? Oh, I'm drawing a picture of God." The parent smiles and looks at the child and says, "My child, don't you know? Nobody knows what God looks like." The kid looks up and smiles and says, "Well, they'll know when I'm finished." That's what we get to do as educators and as caring Jews. We prepare the table. We put out the paper. We get wonderful crayons and wonderful colors. We shine light, and we teach our kids the basic tools. And then we step back and watch with pleasure, please God, as they draw a picture of the smiling face of God. That's the great majesty of what we get to be.
Okay, that's a perfect point to end on. I am supposed to remind everybody that this conversation is recorded and will be available on YouTube under ELI Talk's video. And share the link freely. And I look forward to those of you who participated by listening. If you have thoughts for us, we would love to receive emails or possibilities for continuing the conversation off of this forum. So thank you all very much, and thank you, President Joel.
Thank you for the opportunity and for getting to spend an hour with you, Yossi. It's always a pleasure.
Mine too.